Chapter 92. One Sunday morning, George had left for his weekly visit on Slave Row by the time Massa Leah showed up for daily inspection of the flock. It was the perfect moment. After walking about and talking of gamecocking for a while, Uncle Mingo said, as if it had just occurred to him, "Massa, you knows how every season we culls out dese 15 or 20 good birds that's better'n a whole lots of folks fight with? I believes you can make good side money if'n you lets that boy fight yo' culls in hack fights." Uncle Mingo knew well that the name of Tom Leah, throughout the length and breadth of Caswell County, symbolized the rise of a poor white man to eminence and a major gamecocker who started out as a hack fighter with one good bird. Many a time he had told Uncle Mingo how fondly he looked back upon those early hungry days, declaring that their excitements were at least the equal of those he had enjoyed in all of the major mains he had competed in ever since. The only significant differences, Massa Leah said, were that the big Maine fights involved a better class of people as well as of gamecocks, and much higher amounts of money were wagered. One might see really rich gamecockers winning and losing fortunes in the course of a single fight. Hack fights were for those who were able to fight only 1 or 2 or 3 usually second or third-rate birds, the poor whites, free blacks, or slaves whose pocketbooks could afford bets ranging from 25 cents to $1, with as much as perhaps $20 being bet only when some hack fighter went out of his head and put on the line everything he had in the world. "What makes you think he can handle birds in a cockpit?" asked Massa Leah. Uncle Mingo was relieved to hear no objections to his proposal. "Well, sah, close as you know dat boy watch fights. Reckon he ain't missed a move and you made into cockpits for 5-6 years, massa. And put dat together with just how natural born he is wid roosters. I sho believes he'd need no mo'n a little teachin'. Even fights he'd lose be just cull birds we has around here that you don't ever hardly use nohow, sah." "Uh-huh," the massa murmured, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Well, I don't see nothing wrong with it. Why don't you buff the spurs of some culls and help him practice fights across the summer? If he looks any good by next season, yeah, I'll stake him a little for some bets." "Sho will, yassa." Uncle Mingo was exultant. Since for months now in the gamefowl area's woodsy privacy, he and George had been mock-fighting culled birds, their spurs harmlessly covered with a light leather pouch Uncle Mingo had devised. Being the cautious man he was, the old man hadn't ventured his suggestion to the massa without first ascertaining for himself that his able apprentice showed genuine potential to develop into a really good fight handler. With enough hack fighting experience, he thought privately that George might someday become as expert as Massa Leah at handling birds at a cockpit. As Uncle Mingo had said, even the culls from a flock as good as the massa's were superior to the ones usually pitted in the many hack fights that were staged each season in various impromptu and informal settings around the county. All in all, it seemed to Uncle Mingo that there was practically no way George would miss. "Well, boy, you just gonna stand there with your mouth open?" asked Uncle Mingo when he broke the news that afternoon. "Don't know what to say. Never thought I'd live to see the day you ain't got nothing to say. I just don't know how to thank you. With all them teeth showin', you don't need to. Let's get to work." Every day that summer, he and Uncle Mingo spent at least an hour in the late afternoons squatting on opposite sides of a makeshift cockpit, smaller in diameter and shallower than the regular size, but still sufficient for training. After several weeks, the massa came down to observe one of the sessions. Impressed with the pit-side agility and keen reflexes George showed in handling his bird, he gave him a few cockfight pointers of his own. "You want your bird to get the jump. Now watch me." Taking over Mingo's bird, he said, "Okay, your referee's already hollered, get ready. You're down here holding your bird, but don't watch it. Keep your eyes on that referee's lips. You want to tell the split second he's going to say pit. It's when his lips press together tight." Massa Leah compressed his own lips. "Right then, Snatch up your hands. You'll hear pit just as your bird gets out there first. Some afternoons, after their training session was done and the cull birds they had used had been put back in their pens, Uncle Mingo would sit and tell George about the glory and the money that could be earned in hack fights. Just like the Poe Peckerwoods hollers for massa to win, I seed that gets hollered for at the big hack fights. And if it's much as 10, 12, even mo dollars can be winned in one fight, boy. Ain't never had $1, Uncle Mingo. Don't hardly know what $1 look like. I ain't never had many neither. Fact, ain't got no use for none no mo. But massa say he gonna stake you some bettin' money, and if you wins any, he just might let you have some of it. You reckon he do dat? I specs, 'cause I know he got to be feelin' pretty good 'bout that wing strengthenin' idea of your'n what done put good money in his pocket. Thing is, if he do, is you gonna have sense enough to save up what you get? Sho do dat, I sho would. I's even heerd o' winnin' and savin' enough from hack fightin' to buy deyselves free from dey masses. Buy me and my mammy both. Immediately Uncle Mingo rose from the stump he had been sitting on. The lancing of jealousy that he had just experienced had not only come entirely unexpectedly, but it was also so unsettling deep within him that he found it hard to make any reply. Then he heard himself snapping, "Well, reckon ain't nothin' impossible." Wanting suddenly to get away from a feeling that his own sense of sharing a truly close affection wasn't being equally reciprocated, he walked quickly off toward his cabin, leaving George staring after him, puzzled. At a big cockfight Maine with Massa Leah early during the 1824 season, Uncle Mingo heard from an old trainer he had known for years that a hack fight was due to be held that coming Saturday afternoon behind the large barn of a local plantation. "Reckon he 'bout ready as he ever gonna be, massa," Mingo told the massa later. On Saturday morning, as he had promised, Massa Leah came down and counted out $20 in small bills and coins to Uncle Mingo. "Now, you know my policy," he said to both of them. "Don't get in there fightin' a bird if you're afraid to bet on him. If you bet nothin', you'll never win nothin'. I'm willin' to lose whatever you lose, but I'm puttin' up the money and you're fightin' my chickens. So I want half of any winnin's, you understand that? And if I even think there's any messin' around with my money, I'll take it out of both your black hides." But they could clearly see that he was only putting on a gruff act when he was really in a good humor as they chorused, "Yassa, massa." Rounding the corner of the large gray-painted barn, trying not to show how excited he was, George saw about 20 black hack fighters moving around, laughing and talking on one side of a wide, shallow cockpit. Recognizing about half of them from the big fights they'd attended with their masses, as he had, he waved and smiled his greetings, exchanging nods with others whose colorful dress and cockily independent air made him guess that they must be free blacks. Flicking glances at about an equal number of poor whites just across the cockpit, he was surprised to find that he knew some of them too, and pridefully he overheard one telling another, "Them two's Tom Leah's." Both the black and white hack fighters soon began untying their hay-filled crocus bags, withdrawing their crowing, clucking birds, and starting to limber them up, as Uncle Mingo stepped around the cockpit and said something to the stout, ruddy-faced referee, who nodded with a glance across at George. The boy was diligently massaging his stag when Mingo returned and began working on the other bird they'd brought along. George felt vaguely uneasy at being physically closer than ever before to poor whites, who generally meant nothing but trouble for blacks, but he reminded himself that Uncle Mingo had told him on their way over here that hack fighting was the only thing he knew of that poor whites and blacks did together. The rule was that only 2 whites or 2 blacks fought their birds against each other, but anyone freely could bet on or against any bird in any fight. With his bird well massaged and limbered up and nestled back in its sack, George drank in more of the surrounding hubbub, and he saw yet more hack fighters with filled sacks hurrying toward the barn when the referee began waving his arms. All right now. Let's get started fighting these birds. Jim Carter, Ben Spence, get over here and heel 'em up." 2 gaunt, shabbily dressed white men came forward, weighed in their birds, then fitted on the steel gaffs amid sporadic shouted bets of 25 and 50 cents. As far as George was concerned, neither bird looked any better than mediocre compared to the two culls from the Mass's flock in his and Uncle Mingo's sacks. At the cry, "Pit!" the birds rushed out, burst into the air, and dropped back down, flurrying and feinting, fighting conventionally, George felt, and without the quality of drama he always sensed with Uncle Mingo and the Massa at the big fights. When at last one bird hung a gaff that badly wounded the other in the neck, it took minutes more to finish the kill that George knew would have taken a top-class bird only seconds. He watched the losing owner stalk off bitterly, cursing his bad luck and holding his dead bird by the legs. In a second fight, then in a third, neither the winning nor losing birds showed George the fight fire and style he was used to seeing, so diminishing his nervousness that as the fourth fight wore on, he all but cockily anticipated his own turn in the cockpit. But when it came, his heart immediately started pounding faster. All right. Now Mr. Rome's with a speckled gray and Mr. Leah's with a red bird. Y'all boys heel 'em up." George had recognized his stocky black opponent when they arrived. In fact, several times over the past few years they had talked briefly at the big main fights. Now, feeling Uncle Mingo's eyes fastened on him, George went through the weighing in and then kneeled, unbuttoning the bib pocket of his overalls and pulling out the wrapped gaffs. Tying them onto his rooster's legs, he remembered Mingo's admonition, "Not too loose, or they can get looser and slide down, and not too tight lest they numbs and cramps his legs." Hoping that he was achieving just the right tightness, George heard around him cries, "50 cents on the red, covered, $1 on the gray, got that, $4 on the red." It was Uncle Mingo, barking out by far the biggest bet, triggering a quick rash of cries to cover him. George could feel the excitement of the crowd increasing along with his own. "Get ready." George kneeled, holding his rooster firmly against the ground, feeling its body vibrating in its anxiety to burst into attack. "Pit!" He had forgotten to watch the referee's lips. By the time his hands jerked up, the other bird was already blurring into motion. Scrambling backward, George watched in horror as his bird got hit broadside and knocked tumbling off balance, then gaffed in the right side with such swiftness and force that it was sent reeling. But recovering quickly, it turned to the attack as a patch of feathers began to darken with blood. The two birds flurried upward, his own flying higher, but its gaff somehow missed on the way down. Fainting, they went up again, about evenly high this time, both of their gaffs flashing faster than anyone's eyes could follow. George's heart skipped beats for endless minutes as the birds pecked, feinted, lunged, and leaped all over the cockpit. He knew his rooster had to be weakening from its steady loss of blood, even as it kept countering the rushes of the spangled gray. Then suddenly, with the flash of a spur, it was all over, and George's bird lay quivering and fluttering in its final throes. He scarcely heard the bettor's shouts and curses as he snatched his dying bird from the cockpit, tears bursting forth. He had pushed through the crowd of astonished, staring men when Uncle Mingo roughly seized his elbow and propelled him on beyond where anyone else could hear. "You's actin' like a fool," he rasped. "Go get that other bird for your next fight." "I ain't no good at it, Uncle Mingo. Done got Massa's bird kilt." Mingo seemed incredulous. "Any time birds fight, one gonna lose. Ain't you never seen Massa lose? Now get on back out there." But neither his threats nor urgings were sufficient to move the boy, and finally he stopped trying. "All right, I ain't going back tellin' Massa we was scared to try winnin' his money back." Angrily, Uncle Mingo turned back toward the crowd around the cockpit. Humiliated, George was surprised and grateful that he was hardly noticed by the other hack fighters, who had turned their attention to the next contest. 2 more fights passed before the referee cried out again, "Tom Leah's..." In deeper shame, he heard Mingo bet $10 and get it covered before the old man pitted the second of the Massa's cull birds. It expertly killed its opponent in less than 2 minutes. Uncle Mingo's efforts to console George as they trudged back toward the plantation did little good. "We done made $2, so how come you actin' like somepin dyin'? Just so shame o' losin', and reckon Massa won't hardly want me losin' no mo' his birds." Mingo was so upset that his boy seemed determined to become a loser even before he got started that after George had moped around for 3 days, acting as if he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole, he spoke to Massa Leah about it. "Would you have a word with that boy, Massa? Seemed like he'd think it a disgrace to lose one fight." When the Massa next visited the game fowl area, he accosted George. "What's this I hear you can't lose a fight? Massa, just feel terrible getting yo' bird killed." "Well, I've got 20 more I want you to fight." "Yassa." He was half-hearted even with the Massa's reassurance. But when George won with both birds in his next hack fight, he began to preen and crow like one of his winning roosters. After proudly collecting his bets, Uncle Mingo took him aside and whispered, "Get yo' head big, you be losin' again." "Just let me hold all that money, Uncle Mingo," he exclaimed, holding out his cupped hands. As he stared at the pile of crumpled $1 bills and more in coins, Mingo said laughingly, "You take the money to Massa. Do y'all both good." On their way home, George tried for what seemed the 100th time to persuade Uncle Mingo to visit the slave row to meet his mammy, Miss Melizzy, Sister Sarah, and Uncle Pompey. "Massa ain't got but de 6 o' us, Uncle Mingo. Look like the least we could do is know one another. They sho like to meet you. I talks about you all the time when I's there, but they feels like you don't like 'em or somepin'. You and them both ought to know I can't be against nobody I don't even know," said Mingo. "Let's just keep it like it been. Then they ain't got to worry wid me, and me neither wid them." And once again, when they reached the plantation, Mingo took the path that would give him a wide berth around Slave Row. Kizzy's eyes fairly bugged when she saw the bills and coins in George's palm. "Lawdy, boy, where you get all that?" she demanded, calling Sister Sarah to take a look. "How much is that anyhow?" asked Sarah. "Don't know, ma'am, but plenty more where it came from." Sister Sarah towed George by his free hand to show the windfall to Uncle Pompey. "Spec I better get me a rooster," said the old man. "But look a-here, boy, that's Massa's money." "He gimme half," George explained proudly. "Fact, I gotta go give him his share right now." Presenting himself at the kitchen, George showed Miss Melizzy the money, then asked to see the Massa. When Massa Leah pocketed his $9 winnings, he laughed. "Hell, I think Mingo's slipping you my best birds and me the culls." George was beside himself. In the next hack fight, George won with 2 birds he had won with before, and Massa Leah grew so intrigued by George's string of victories that he finally ignored his self-imposed objections to attending a hack fight. The Massa's unexpected arrival prompted hasty nudges and whispers among both the white and black hack fighters. Seeing even Uncle Mingo and George nervous and uncertain, Massa Leah began to feel misgivings that he had come. Then, realizing that any initiative must be his own, he began grinning and waving at one of the older poor whites. "Hi, Jim," then to another, "Hey there, Pete." They grinned back, astounded that he even remembered their names. "Hey, Dave," he went on, "see your wife kicked out the rest of your teeth, or was it that bad whiskey?" Amid uproarious laughter, the hack fight seemed nearly forgotten as they crowded around the man who had started out as poor as any of them and then became a legend for them. Bursting with pride, George cradled his bird under one arm, and astonishing Uncle Mingo as well as Massa Leah, he was suddenly strutting around the edges of the cockpit. All right, he cried out loudly. "Any y'all got any money? Get it on the line. Don't care what you bets. If I can't cover it, my Massa show can, rich as he is." Seeing the Massa smiling, George grew yet louder. "Dis here just his cull bird I's fightin', and he beat anything out here. Come on." An hour later, after ballyhooing a second winning fight, George had won $22 and Massa Leah nearly 40 from accepting side bets pressed upon him. He really hated to take the money from men whom he knew to be as dirt poor as he once had been, but he knew they would go the rest of the year boastfully lying how they had lost 10 times as much as they had in betting against Tom Leah. The cocky, self-proclaiming George was missed when he didn't show up at 4 of Caswell County's next hack fights, for Uncle Mingo was suffering from another siege of severe coughing spells. George saw how they came on him suddenly, without warning, and then persisted, and he felt he shouldn't leave his old teacher alone with the game fowl, nor did he wish to go by himself. But even when Mingo had improved somewhat, he said he still didn't feel quite up to walking all the way to the next hack fight, but he demanded that George go anyway. "You ain't no baby. You should be gone quick enough if it was some gal's dare." So George went alone, carrying in each hand a bulging bag containing a gamecock cull. As he came into view of the gamecockers who had been missing his recently colorful presents, one of them cried loudly, "Look out, here come dat Chicken George." There was a burst of laughter from them all, and he heartily joined in. The more he thought of it on his way home, with still more winnings in his pocket, the better he liked the sound of that name. It had a certain flair. "Betcha none y'all can guess what they done name me at the hack fight," he said the moment he arrived on Slave Row. "Nah, what? Chicken George." "Do Lawd!" exclaimed Sister Sarah. Kizzy's love and pride shone from her eyes. "Well," she said, "it's show about close as anybody gonna get to scribing you nowadays." The nickname even amused Massa Leah when he was told it by Uncle Mingo, who added wryly, "Wonder to me they ain't callin' him Cryin' George, the way he still bust out cryin' any time a bird he fight and get kilt. Much as he winnin' nowadays, don't make no difference. Just let a killin' gaff hit his rooster, and he gushin' and blubberin' and huggin' dat bird like it his own child. Is you ever heard or seed the like o' dat before, Massa?" Massa Leah laughed. "Well, plenty times I felt like crying myself when I'd bet a lot more'n I ought to, and my bird caught a gaff. But no, I guess he's the only one I've heard of taking on like you say. I think he just gets too attached to chickens." Not long afterward, at the biggest main of the year, the massa was returning to the wagon, carrying his bird, which had just won in the final contest, when he heard someone shout, "Oh, Mr. Leah!" Turning, he was astonished to see the gamecocker aristocrat George Jewett striding toward him, smiling. Massa Leah managed to make himself sound casual. "Oh, yes, Mr. Jewett." Then they were shaking hands. "Mr. Leah, I'll be very frank, as one gentleman and gamecocker to another. I've recently lost my trainer. The road patrol stopped him without a pass the other night. Unfortunately, he tried to run and was shot. Badly. It's not likely he'll pull through. Sorry to hear it. For you, I mean, not the..." Massa Leah cursed his confusion, guessing at what was coming. The aristocrat wanted Mingo. "Of course," said Jewett, "so I find myself needing at least a temporary trainer, one who knows at least something about birds." He paused. "I've noticed at our cockfights you've got 2 of them. I wouldn't think of wanting your experienced older one, but I wonder if you would entertain a fair offer for the other, the young one who's sparkin' one of the gals on my place. Tell me." Massa Leah's astonishment mixed with fury at this evidence of treachery by Chicken George. He sounded choked. "Oh, I see." Massa Jewett smiled again, knowing he'd drawn blood. "Let me prove I'm not wishing to engage us in bargaining." He paused. "Would 3,000 be all right?" Massa Leah was staggered, not sure if he had heard right. "I'm sorry, Mr. Jewett," he heard himself say flatly. He felt the thrill of refusing a rich blue blood. "All right," Jewett's voice tightened. "My final offer. 4. I'm just not selling my trainers, Mr. Jewett." The rich gamecocker's face fell. His eyes had gone cold. "I understand. Of course. Good day to you, sir." "The same to you, sir," said Massa Leah, and they strode away in opposite directions. The massa returned to the wagon as quickly as he could without running, his rage rising. Uncle Mingo and Chicken George, seeing his face, sat with their own carefully blank. Reaching the wagon, he brandished his fist at George, his voice trembling with fury. "I'll bash your brains in. What the hell are you doing over at Jewett's? Telling him how we train chickens?" Chicken George turned ashen. "Ain't told Massa Jewett nothin', Massa." He could hardly speak. "Ain't spoke nary word to him never, Massa." His total astonishment and fright half convinced Massa Leah. "You trying to tell me you're going way the hell over there just to tomcat with Jewett's wench?" Even if it was innocent, he knew how every visit exposed his apprentice trainer to Jewett's cunning, which could lead to anything. "Massa, Lawdy mercy!" Another wagon now was pulling close by, with men calling and waving to the massa. Returning their waves, Massalia slitted his mouth into a smile and went clambering up onto the farthest edge of the wagon seat, snapping at the terrified Uncle Mingo out of the corner of his mouth. "Drive, goddammit!" A knife could have cut the tension during the seemingly endless trip back to the plantation. Nor was the tension much less taut between Uncle Mingo and Chicken George during the rest of the day. That night, a sleepless George lay in a sweat of anticipation over the punishment he knew was coming. But none came, and a few days later the massa said to Uncle Mingo, as if nothing had happened, "Next week I've got a bid to fight birds just over the state line in Virginia. I know that long ride wouldn't do your coughing spells any good, so I'll just take the boy." "Yassa, massa." Uncle Mingo had long known this day was coming. That's why the massa had trained the boy to replace him, but he hadn't dreamed it would come so soon. Chapter 93. What are you thinking about so hard, boy? After more than an hour sharing the wagon seat and watching the warm February morning's fleecy clouds, the dusty load stretching ahead, or the monotonously flexing muscles of the mules' rumps, Massalia's sudden question started Chicken George. "Nothin'," he replied. "Wasn't thinking about nothin', massa." "Something I ain't never understood about you." There was an edge in Massalia's voice. "Man try to talk to y'all decent, you right away start acting stupid. Makes me madder'n hell. Especially like you that talks his head off if he wants to. Don't you reckon white people would respect you more if you acted like you had some sense?" Chicken George's lulled mind had sprung to keen alertness. "They might, then again some might not, massa," he said carefully. "It'll all depend." "There you go with that round the mulberry bush talk. Depend on what?" Still parrying until he got a better idea of what the massa was up to, Chicken George offered yet another meringue of words. "Well, sir, I means like it depend on what white folks you talkin' to, massa. Leastways, that's what I gets the impression." Massalia spat disgustedly over the side of the wagon. "Feed and clothe, put a roof over his head, give him everything else he needs in this world, and that will never give you one straight answer." Chicken George risked a guess that the massa had simply decided upon impulse to open some sort of conversation with him, hoping to enliven what had become a boring and seemingly endless wagon ride. In order to stop irritating Massalia, he tested the water by saying, "You wants the straight up and down truth, massa? I believes Mose figure dey's bein' smart to act maybe dummer'n dey really is, 'cause Mose is scared of white folks." "Scared!" exclaimed Massalia. "Slick as eels, that's what. I guess it's scared. Plotting uprisings to kill us every time we turn around, poisoning white people's food, even killing babies, anything you can name against white people. Doing it all the time, and when white people act to protect themselves, hollerin' they so scared." Chicken George thought it would be wise to stop fiddling with the massa's hair-trigger temper. "Don't believe none on yo' place ever done nothing like that, massa," he said quietly. "You know I'd kill you if you did." A gamecock crowed loudly in its coop behind them, and some others clucked in response. George said nothing. They were passing a large plantation, and he glanced across at a group of slaves beating down the dead corn stalks in preparation for plowing before the next planting. Massalia spoke again. "It makes me sick to think how tough can make it for a man that's worked hard all his life trying to build up something." The wagon rolled on in silence for a while, but Chicken George could feel the massa's anger rising. Finally the massa exclaimed, "Boy, let me tell you something. You been all your life on my place with your belly full. You don't know nothing about what it's like to grow up scufflin' and half-starvin' with 10 brothers and sisters and your mama and papa all sleepin' in 2 hot, leaky rooms." Chicken George was astonished at such an admission from the massa, who went on heatedly as if he had to get the painful memories out of his system. "Boy, I can't remember when my mama's belly wasn't big with another baby, and my papa chawin' his tobacco and half drunk, forever hollerin' and cussin' that none of us was workin' hard enough to suit him on 10 rocky acres that I wouldn't give 50 cents an acre for, where he called himself a farmer. Glaring at Chicken George, he said angrily, "You want to know what changed my life?" "Yassa," said George. This big faith healer came. Everybody was running around excited about his big tent being put up. The opening night, everybody who could walk, even those who needed to be carried, were overflowing that tent. Later on, people said there had never been such a hellfire sermon and such miracle cures in Caswell County. I never will forget the sight of those hundreds of white people leaping, screaming, shouting, and testifying. People falling out in one another's arms, moaning and twitching, and having the jerks. Worse than you'll see at any camp meeting. But midst all that ruckus and hurrah, there was one thing that somehow or another really hit me. Massa Leah looked at Chicken George. "You know anything about the Bible?" "Not well, Nasa, not to speak of." "Bet you wouldn't have thought I know nothing about it either. It was from the Psalm. I've got that place marked in my own Bible. It says, 'I have been young and now am old. Yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread.'" After that preacher was long gone, that saying stuck in my head. I turned it up and down and sideways, trying to figure out what meaning it had for me. Everything I saw in my family was translated to begging bread. We didn't have nothing, and we wasn't going to get nothing. Finally, it seemed like that saying meant if I made myself to get righteous, in other words, if I worked hard and lived the best I knew how, I'd never have to beg for bread when I was old. The massa looked at Chicken George defiantly. "Yassa," said Chicken George, not knowing what else to say. "That's when I left home," Massa Leah went on. "I was 11 years old. I hit the road, asking any and everybody for a job, doing anything, including work. I was ragged. I ate scraps. I saved every cent I got, I mean for years, until I finally bought my first 25 woodsland acres, along with my first name of George. Fact, that's who I named you for." The massa seemed to expect some response. "Uncle Pompey told me about him," said Chicken George. "Yeah, Pompey came along later, my second. Boy, you hear what I tell you. I worked shoulder to shoulder alongside that George. We slaved from can to cant, rooting up stumps and brush and rocks to plant my first crop. It wasn't nothing but the Lord that made me buy a 25-cent lottery ticket, and that ticket won me my first gamecock. Boy, that was the best bird I ever had. Even when he got cut bad, I'd patch him up, and he went on to win more hack fights than anyone ever heard of one rooster doing." He paused. "Don't know how come I'm sitting up here talking this way to but I guess a man just need to talk to somebody sometime." He paused again. "Can't do no talking to your wife much. Seem like once a woman catches a husband to take care of them, they spend the rest of their lives either sick, resting, or complaining about something, with waiting on them hand and foot, or they're forever patting their faces with powder till they look like ghosts." Chicken George couldn't believe his ears, but the massa couldn't seem to stop himself. "Or then you can get the other kind, like my family. I've wondered a lot of times why none of my 9 brothers and sisters didn't fight to get away like I did. They're still scuffling and starving just the same as the day I left. Only now they've all got their own families." Chicken George decided that he had best not acknowledge with even a yassa anything the massa was saying about his family, some of whom George had seen briefly talking with the massa when they were at cockfights or in town. Massa Leah's brothers were dirt poor crackers of the sort that not only the rich planters but also even their slaves sneered at. Time and again he had seen how embarrassed the massa was to meet any of them. He had overheard their constant whining about hard times and their begging for money, and he had seen the hatred on their faces when the massa gave them the 50 cents or $1 that he knew they were going to spend on white lightning. Chicken George thought of how many times he had heard Miss Melizzy tell how, when the massa used to invite members of his family home for dinner, they would eat and drink enough to glut 3 times their own number, and the moment he was out of earshot, would heap scorn on him as if he were a dog. "Any one of them could have done what I did," Massa Leah exclaimed beside him on the wagon seat, "but they didn't have the gumption, so the hell with them." He fell silent again, but not for long. "One way or another, I've got things going along pretty good now. a respectable roof to live under, my 100 or so game birds, and 85 acres with over half of it in crops, along with the horse, mules, cows, and hogs. And I've got you few lazy. Yassa, said Chicken George, thinking that it might be reasonably safe to express in a mild way another point of view. But us works hard for you too, massa. Long's I been knowin' my mammy and Miss Melizzy and Sister Sarah and Uncle Pompey and Uncle Mingo. Ain't they been workin' for you hard as they can? And before the massa could reply, he tacked on something Sister Sarah had mentioned during his visit to Slave Row the previous Sunday. Fact, massa, 'ceptin' for my mammy, ain't none of 'em less'n 50 years old. He stopped himself, not about to add Sister Sarah's conclusion that the massa was simply too cheap to buy any younger slaves, apparently expecting to work the few he had until they dropped dead. You must not have been paying attention to all I've been tellin' you, boy. Ain't a I got worked as hard as me, so don't come tellin' me how hard work. Yassa. Yassa what? Just yassa. You shall work hard too, massa. Damn right. You think it's easy being responsible for everything and everybody on my place? You think it's easy keeping up a big flock of chickens? Nassa, I know for sure that's hard on you, massa. George thought of Uncle Mingo's having attended the game flock every day for more than 30 years, not to mention his own 7. Then, as a ploy to emphasize Mingo's decades of service, he asked innocently, Massa, is you got any idea how old is Uncle Mingo? Massa Leah paused, rubbing his chin. Hell, I really don't know. Let's see, I once figured he's around 15 years older than I am. That would put him somewhere up in his early 60s, and getting older every day. Seems like he getting sick more and more every year. How does he seem to you? You're living down there around him. Chicken George's mind flashed to Uncle Mingo's recent bout of coughing, the worst one he had ever yet suffered, as far as he knew. Remembering how Miss Melizzy and Sister Sarah often declared that the massa viewed any claim of sickness on their part as sheer laziness, he said finally, Well, massa, most of time seem like he feelin' fine, but I believes you really ought to know he do get real bad coughin' spells sometimes. So bad I get scared, 'cause he just like a daddy to me. Catching himself too late, instantly he sensed a hostile reaction. A bump in the road set the cooped gamecocks clucking again, and for several moments the wagon rolled on before Massa Leah demanded, What's Mingo done so much for you? Was it him took you out of the fields and sent you down there with a shack for yourself? Nassa, you done all that, massa. They rode in the silence for a while until the massa decided to speak again. I hadn't much thought about what you said there back a ways, but now that you mention it, I really got me a bunch of old. Some of 'em bound to start breaking down on me any time now, god damn it. Much as cost nowadays, I'm going to have to buy 1 or 2 younger field hands. He turned as if accosting Chicken George. You see what I'm talking about? The kind of things I have to worry about all the time? Yassa, massa. Yassa, massa. That's the answer to everything. You sure wouldn't want no disagreeing, would you, sir? Well, can't you find something to say beside yassa, massa? Nah, sir. I means, well, sir, leastways you got some money to buy wid, massa. This season you win so good into cockfights. Chicken George was hoping to move the conversation on to a safer subject. Massa, he asked guilelessly, is it any gamecockers ain't got no farm at all? I means don't raise no crops, just nothing but chickens? Not that I know of, unless it's some of those city slickers, but I never heard of any of them with enough birds to be called serious gamecockers. He thought for a moment. In fact, it's usually the more gamecocks, the bigger the farm, like that Mr. Jewett's place where you've been tomcatting. Chicken George could have kicked himself for handing the massa that kind of an opening, and he quickly sought to close it. Ain't been over there no more, massa. After a pause, Massa Leah said, Found you another wench somewhere else, huh? Chicken George hesitated before replying, I stays close now, massa, which avoided a direct lie. Massa Leah scoffed. Big, strapping 20-year-old buck like you? Boy, don't tell me you're not slipping around nights getting plenty of that good hot tail. Hell, I could hire you out to stud, bettin' you'd like that. The Massa's face creased into a half leer. Good friend of mine says them black wenches got plenty good hot tail. Now tell me the truth, ain't that right, boy? Chicken George thought of the Massa with his mammy. Steaming inside, he said slowly, almost coldly, "Maybe dey is, Massa." Then defensively, "I don't know dat many." "Well, okay, you don't want to tell you've been slipping off my place at night. But I know it's time, and I know where you go and how often you go. I don't want that road patrol maybe shooting you like happened to that Mr. Jewett's trainer. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do, boy. When we get back, I'm going to write you out a travelin' pass to go chase tail every night if you want to. Ain't never thought I'd do that for no." Massa Leah seemed almost embarrassed, then covered it with a frown. "But I'm going to tell you one thing. First time you mess up, don't get back by daybreak, or too wore out to work, or I find you've been on that Jewett place again, or anything else you know you're not supposed to do, I'm tearing up the pass for good. And you get along with it. Got that?" Chicken George was incredulous. "Massa, I sho appreciate that. Sho do, Massa." Expansively, Massa Leah waved away the thanks. "All right now, you see I'm not half as bad as you make out. You can tell him I know how to treat a good if I want to." The leering grin returned. "Okay, what about them hot black winches, boy? How many can you mount in a night?" Chicken George was squirming in his seat. "Suh, like I said, ain't no many." But his words seemed unheard as Massa Leah went on. "I hear tell whole lots of white men go and find women for their pleasure. You know that happens, don't you, boy?" "I's heard of it, Massa," he said, trying not to think about the fact that he was talking to his own father. But apart from what went on in plantation cabins, George knew that in Burlington, Greensboro, and Durham there were special houses, spoken of only in hushed tones, usually run by some free black woman, where he had heard that white men paid from 50 cents to $1 to couple with women in their choice of colors from sooty black to high yaller. "Hell," the Massa persisted, "I'm just talking to you sitting up here by ourselves in this wagon. From what I hear tell, they're women, all right, but by God, they're women. Especially if it's one of the kind that lets a man know she wants it as much as he does. I hear tell they can be as hot as firecrackers, not always claimin' they're sick and whinin' about everything under the sun." The Massa looked inquisitively at Chicken George. "Fellow I know told me you boys can't never get enough of that hot black tail. That your experience?" "Massa, nossa. Leastways, I mean, just now, sho ain't." "There you go talking round the maypole again." "Don't mean round no pole, Massa." Chicken George was trying his best to project his seriousness. "I's trying to say something to you I ain't never told nobody, Massa. You know dat Massa McGregor with them spangle yellow birds in the cockfights?" "Of course, he and I talk a lot. What's he got to do with it?" "Well, you done give your word you gon' give me a pass, so ain't no need me lyin'. Well, yassa, lately I been slippin' out just like you say, visitin' dis there gal over at Massa McGregor's." His face was a study in earnestness. "This here's something I really been needin' to talk with somebody I really can talk to, Massa. Just can't figure her out. She named Matilda. She work in the field, and fill in if they needs her in the big house. Massa, she the first gal don't care what I said or tried, won't let herself be touched, nassa. Best I can get, she say she like me all right, 'cept she can't stain my ways, and I told her I sho ain't got no use for her'n either. I told her I can get all the womens I wants. She just say go get 'em den, leave her alone." Massa Leah was listening to Chicken George as incredulously as he had to the Massa. "And another thing," he went on. "Every time I goes back she keep quoting the Bible on me. How come she read the Bible? A preacher Massa raised her till his 'ligion made him sell his fact, I tell you how 'ligious she is. She heard 'bout bunch of free giving a big night frolic wid eatin' and liquor and dancin' somewheres in de woods round over there. Well, this gal ain't but 17. slip way from Massa McGregor's and bust in on dat frolic while it going on hot and heavy. Dey says she commence sich a carrying on shouting for the Lord to come save dem sinners, fo the devil get there and burn 'em up, that every one of them free near 'bout run over the other one leaving there, dey fiddler hard behind 'em. Massa Leah laughed uproariously. Sounds like a hell of a gal, I'll say that. Massa, Chicken George hesitated. Fo I met her, I has been catchin' just much tail as you says, but dog if she ain't got me feelin' mo to it than just tail. Man get to thinkin' 'bout jumpin' the broom wid a good woman. Chicken George was astounded at himself. That is, if she have me, he said in a weak voice. Then even more weakly, and if'n you wouldn't make no objections. They rode on quite a way amid the wagon's squeakings and the gamecock's cluckings before Massa Leah spoke again. Does Mr. McGregor know you've been courtin' this gal of his? Well, she bein' a field hand, don't imagine she never say nothin' to him directly, nossa. But the big house knows. I spec some of dem done told it. After another lull, Massa Leah said, How many has Mr. McGregor got? He got pretty big place, massa. Seem like from the size his slave row, I'd reckon 20 or more. Massa. George was confused by the questions. Been thinking, said the massa, after another silence. Since you were born, you never give me any real trouble. In fact, you've helped me around the place a lot, and I'm going to do something for you. You just heard me saying a while back I need some younger field hand. Well, if that gal's a big enough fool to jump the broom with somebody who loves run and tail as much as I expect you won't never quit doin', then I'll ride over and talk with Mr. McGregor. If he's got as many as you say, he ought not to miss one field gal all that much, if he can come to a decent price. Then you could move that gal, what's her name? Matilda, massa, breathed Chicken George, unsure if he was hearing right. Then you could move her over to my place, build y'all a cabin. George's mouth worked, but no sound came out. Finally he blurted, Nothin' but high-class massa do dat. Massa Leah grunted. He gestured, Long as you understand, your first place remains down with Mingo. Coase, sah. Mustering a scowl, Massa Leah directed a stabbing forefinger at his driver. After you get hitched, I'm taking back that travelin' pass. Help that what's-her-name, Matilda. Keep your black ass home where it belongs. Chicken George was beyond words. Chapter 94. When the sun rose on the morning of Chicken George's wedding in August of 1827, the groom was frantically fastening iron hinges onto the cured oak door jamb of his still uncompleted 2-room cabin. Loping to the barn when that was done, he hurried back carrying over his head the new door that Uncle Pompey had carved and stained with the juice of crushed black walnut hulls, and mounted it in place. Then, casting a worried glance at the rising sun, he stopped long enough to wolf down the sausage and biscuit sandwich that had been practically thrown at him by his mammy late the previous evening in her fury at his long succession of put-offs, excuses, interruptions, and excursions. He had waited so long and worked so slowly that she had finally commanded everyone else not only to stop helping him anymore, but also even to stop offering him any encouragement. Chicken George next quickly filled a large keg with slaked lime and water, stirred it vigorously, and, as fast as he could, dipped his large brush into the mess and began slathering whitewash over the outside of the rough sawn planking. It was about 10 o'clock when he finally backed away, almost as whitened as the cabin, to survey the completed job. There was plenty of time to spare, he told himself. All he had to do was bathe and dress, then take the 2-hour wagon ride to the McGregor plantation, where the wedding was due to start at 1. Bounding between the cabin and the well, he dashed 3 bucketfuls of water into the new galvanized tub in the cabin's front room. Humming loudly as he scrubbed himself, he dried himself off briskly and then wrapped himself in the bleached sacking towel to run into the bedroom. After climbing into his cotton long drawers, he slipped on his blue stiff front shirt, red socks, yellow pants, and yellow belt-backed suit coat, and finally his brand new bright orange shoes, all of which he had bought with hack-fighting winnings, an item at a time, over the past few months while he and the Massalia were traveling to various North Carolina cities. Squeaking in his stiff shoes over to the bedroom table and sitting down on Uncle Mingo's wedding present, a carved stool with a seat of woven hickory strips, Chicken George smiled widely at himself in the long-handled mirror that was going to be one of his surprise presents for Matilda. With the mirror's help, he carefully arranged around his neck the green woolen scarf Matilda had knitted for him. Looking good, he had to admit. There remained only the crowning touch. Pulling a round cardboard box out from under the bed, he removed the top and with almost reverent gentleness lifted out the black derby hat that was his wedding present from Massalia. Turning it around and around on stiff forefingers, he savored its stylish shape almost sensuously before returning to the mirror and positioning the derby at just the right rakish tilt over one eye. "Get out'n dere, we been settin' an hour in dis wagon," his Mammy Kizzy's shout from just outside the window left no doubt that her rage was undiminished. "Come in, Mammy," he hollered back. After one last appreciation of his ensemble in the mirror, he slipped a flat black bottle of white lightning into his inside coat pocket and emerged from the new cabin as if expecting applause. He was going to flash his biggest smile and tip his hat until he got a look at the baleful glares of his Mammy, Miss Melizzy, Sister Sarah, and Uncle Pompey, all sitting frozenly in their Sunday best in the wagon. Averting his glance and whistling as breezily as he could manage, he climbed up onto the driver's seat, careful not to disturb a crease, slapped the reins against the backs of the two mules, and they were underway, only an hour late. Along the road, Chicken George sneaked several fortifying nips from his bottle, and the wagon arrived at the McGregor place shortly after 2. Kizzy, Sister Sarah, and Miss Melizzy descended amid profuse apologies to the visibly worried and upset Matilda in her white gown. Uncle Pompey unloaded the food baskets they had brought, and after pecking at Matilda's cheek, Chicken George went swaggering about slapping backs and breathing liquor in the faces of the guests as he introduced himself. Apart from those he already knew who lived in Matilda's slave row, they were mostly prayer-meeting folk she had recruited from among the slaves of 2 nearby plantations and whom she had gotten permission to invite. She wanted them to meet her intended, and so did they. Though most of them had heard a lot about him from sources other than herself, their first actual sight of Chicken George evoked reactions ranging from muttering to open-mouthed astonishment. As he cut his swath through the wedding party, he gave a wide berth to Kizzy, Sister Sarah, and Miss Melizzy, whose dagger stares were being sharpened by every remark each was overhearing about the dubiousness of Matilda's catch. Uncle Pompey had chosen simply to merge with the other guests as if he were unaware of who the bridegroom was. Finally, the hired white preacher came out of the big house, followed by the Masses and Mrs. McGregor and Leah. They stopped in the backyard, the preacher clutching his Bible like a shield, and the suddenly quiet crowd of black people grouped stiffly a respectful distance away. As Matilda's missus had planned it, the wedding would combine some of the white Christian wedding service with jumping the broom afterward. Guiding her rapidly sobering groom by one yellow sleeve, Matilda positioned them before the preacher, who cleared his throat and proceeded to read a few solemn passages from his Bible. Then he asked Matilda and George, "Do you solemnly swear to take each other, for better or worse, the rest of your lives?" "I does," said Matilda softly. "Yassa," said Chicken George, much too loudly. Flinching, the preacher paused and then said, "I pronounce you man and wife." Among the black guests, someone sobbed, "Now you may kiss the bride." Seizing Matilda, Chicken George crushed her in his arms and gave her a resounding smack. Amid the ensuing gasps and tongue-clucking, it occurred to him that he might not be making the best impression, and while they locked arms and jumped the broom, he racked his brains for something to say that would lend some dignity to the occasion, something that would placate his Slave Row family and win over the rest of those Bible-toters. He had it. "The Lord is my shepherd," he proclaimed. "He done give me what I wants." When he saw the stares and glares that greeted this announcement, he decided to give up on them, and the first chance he got, he slipped the bottle from his pocket and drained it dry. The rest of the festivities, a wedding feast and reception, passed in a blur, and it was Uncle Pompey who drove the Leah Plantation's wagon homeward through the sunset. Grim and mortified, Mammy Kizzy, Miss Melizzy, and Sister Sarah cast malevolent glances at the spectacle behind them. The bridegroom snoring soundly with his head in the lap of his tearful bride, his green scarf askew and most of his face concealed under his black derby. Chicken George snorted awake when the wagon jerked to a stop alongside their new cabin. Sensing groggily that he should beg everyone's forgiveness, he began to try, but the doors of 3 cabins slammed like gunshots. But he wouldn't be denied a last courtly gesture. Picking up his bride, he pushed open the door with one foot and somehow maneuvered both of them inside without injury, only to stumble with her over the tub of bath water that still stood in the middle of the room. It was the final humiliation, but all was forgotten and forgiven when Matilda, with a shriek of joy, caught sight of her special wedding present, the highly lacquered 8-day winding grandfather clock, as tall as herself, that Chicken George had purchased with the last of his hack-fight savings and hauled in the back of the wagon all the way from Greensboro. As he sat bleary-eyed on the floor where he'd fallen, bath-water soaking his brand-new orange shoes, Matilda went over to him and reached out her hand to help him up. "You come with me now, George. I'm gonna put you to bed." Chapter 95. By daybreak, Chicken George was gone back down the road to his game fowl. Then, about an hour after breakfast, Miss Melizzy heard someone calling her name, and, going to the kitchen door, she was startled to see the new bride, whom she greeted and invited inside. "No'm, thank you," said Matilda. "I just wanted to ax which way is the field they's working in today, and whereabouts can I find me a hoe?" A few minutes later, Matilda simply appeared and joined Kizzy, Sister Sarah, and Uncle Pompey in the day's field work. Late that evening they all gathered about her in Slave Row, keeping her company until her husband got home. In the course of conversation, Matilda asked if any Slave Row prayer meetings were held regularly, and when she was told that none were, proposed that one be made a part of each Sunday afternoon. "Tell you the truth, I's 'shamed to say I ain't done nowhere near to prayin' I ought to," said Kizzy. "Me neither," confessed Sister Sarah. "Just ain't never seemed to me no amount of prayin' as did nothin' to change white folks," said Uncle Pompey. "The Bible say Joseph was sold a slave to the Egyptians, but the Lord was with Joseph, and the Lord blessed the Egyptians' house for Joseph's sake," Matilda said in a matter-of-fact manner. 3 glances, quickly exchanged, expressed their steadily mounting respect for the young woman. "Dat George told us yo' first massa a preacher," said Sister Sarah. "You sound like a preacher yourself." "I's a servant of the Lord, that's all," replied Matilda. Her prayer meetings began the following Sunday, 2 days after Chicken George and Massa Leah had gone off in the wagon with 12 gamecocks. "Massa say he finally got the right birds to go fight where the big money is," he explained, saying that this time the Leah birds would be competing in an important main somewhere near Goldsboro. One morning when they were out in the field, carefully employing a gentle tone that suggested the sympathy of a 47-year-old woman for a new bride of 18, Sister Sarah said, "Lawdy, honey, I 'spect yo' married life gonna be split up twixt you and dem chickens." Matilda looked at her squarely. "What I done always heard and believed is anybody's marriage just what they makes it, and I reckon he know what kind he want ourn to be." But having established her stand about marriage, Matilda would readily share in any conversation about her colorful husband, whether it was humorous or serious in nature. "He done had itchy foot since he was a crawlin' baby," Kizzy told her one night, visiting in the new cabin. "Yes, ma'am," said Matilda. "I figured dat when he come a-courtin'. He wouldn't talk about hardly nothin' 'cept rooster fightin' and him and the massa travelin' somewheres. Hesitating, she then added in her frank way, "But when he found out weren't no man gonna have his way wid me 'fore we jumped a broom, Lawd, he had a fit. Fact, one time I give up on seein' him again. Don't know what hit him, but I like to fell out the night he come a rushin' in and say, 'Look, let's us get hitched.' Well, I sho glad he had the sense," said Kizzy. "But now you's hitched, gal, I's gonna tell you straight what's on my mind. I wants me some grandchillens." "Ain't nothin' wrong with that, Miss Kizzy, 'cause I wants me some young'uns too, same as other women's haves." When Matilda announced 2 months later that she was in a family way, Kizzy was beside herself. Thinking about her son becoming a father made her think about her father more than she had in many years. And one evening, when Chicken George was away again, Kizzy asked, "Has he ever mentioned anything to you about his grandpappy?" "No'm, he ain't." Matilda looked puzzled. "He ain't?" Seeing the older woman's disappointment, Matilda added quickly, "Reckon he just ain't got to it yet, Mammy Kizzy." Deciding that she'd better do it herself, since she remembered more than he did anyway, Kizzy began telling Matilda of her life at Massa Waller's for 16 years until her sale to Massa Leah, and most of what she had to say was about her African pappy and the many things he had told her. "Tilda, how come I's telling you all this? I just wants you to understand how I wants that child in yo' belly, and any mo' you has to know all about him too, on count of he's dey great-granddaddies." "I sho does understand, Mammy Kizzy," said Matilda, whereupon her mother-in-law told yet more of her memories, with both of them feeling their closeness growing throughout the rest of the evening. Chicken George's and Matilda's baby boy was born during the spring of 1828, with Sister Sarah serving as the midwife, assisted by a nervous Kizzy. Her joy about having a grandchild at last tempered her anger that the boy's father was yet again off somewhere for a week with Massa Leah. The following evening, when the new mother felt up to it, everybody on Slave Row gathered at the cabin to celebrate the birth of the second baby that had been born there on the Leah plantation. "You's finally Grandmammy Kizzy now," said Matilda, propped up in bed against some pillows, nestling the baby and weakly smiling at her visitors. "Lawd, yes, don't it sound pretty?" exclaimed Kizzy, her whole face one big grin. "Sound like Timmy Kizzy gettin' old, that's what," said Uncle Pompey with a twinkle in his eye. "Huh, ain't no woman here ole as some we knows," snorted Sister Sarah. Finally Miss Melizzy commanded, "All right, time us all get out in here and let 'em rest." And they all did, except for Kizzy. After being quietly thoughtful for a while, Matilda said, "Ma'am, I've been thinking about what you told me about yo' pappy. Since I never even got to see mine, I believes George wouldn't care if this child have my pappy's name. It was Virgil, my mammy say." The name instantly had Chicken George's hearty approval when he returned, filled with such jubilance at the birth of a son that he could hardly contain himself. Black Derby awry as his big hand swooped the infant up in the air, he exclaimed, "Mammy, 'member what I tole you? I gonna tell my young'uns what you tole me," his face alight. He made a little ceremony of seating himself before the fireplace with Virgil held upright in his lap as he spoke to him in grand tones. "Listen here, boy, gonna tell you about yo' great-granddaddy. He were a African that say he named Kunta Kinte. He call a guitar a ko, and a river Kambi Balungo, and lot mo' things with African names. He say he was chopping a tree to make his little brother a drum when it was 4 men's come up and grabbed him from behind. Then a big ship brung him cross the big water to a place called Napolis. And he had runned off 4 times when he tried to kill them that cotched him, and they cut half his foot off." Lifting the infant, he turned his face toward Kizzy, and he jumped the broom with the big house cook named Miss Bell, and they had a little old gal. And there she is, yo' grandmammy, grinning at you right there. Matilda was beaming her approval as widely as Kizzy, whose eyes were moist with love and pride. With her husband away as much as he was, Matilda began spending more of her time in the evenings with Grandmammy Kizzy, and after a while they were pooling their rations and eating their supper together. Always Matilda would say the grace as Kizzy sat quietly with her hands folded and her head bowed. Afterward, Matilda would nurse the baby, and then Kizzy would sit proudly with little Virgil clasped against her body, rocking him back and forth, either humming or singing to him softly as the grandfather clock ticked and Matilda sat reading her worn Bible. Even though it wasn't against the Massa's rules, Kizzy still disapproved of reading, but it was the Bible, so she guessed no harm could come of it. Usually, not too long after the baby was asleep, Kizzy's head would begin bobbing, and often she would begin murmuring to herself as she dozed. When she leaned over to retrieve the sleeping Virgil from Kizzy's arms, Matilda sometimes heard snatches of the things she was mumbling. They were always the same. "Mammy, Pappy, don't let 'em take me. My people's loss. Ain't never see 'em no mo' dis world." Deeply touched, Matilda would whisper something like, "We's yo' people now, Grandmammy Kizzy," and after putting Virgil to bed, she would gently rouse the older woman, whom she was growing to love as she had her own mother, and after accompanying her to her own cabin, Matilda would often be wiping at her eyes on her way back. On Sunday afternoons, only the three women attended Matilda's prayer services at first, until Sister Sarah's sharp tongue finally shamed Uncle Pompey into joining them. No one ever even thought about inviting Chicken George, for even when he was at home, by Sunday noon he would have returned to the game-fowl area. With the little group of 5 seated solemnly on chairs brought from their cabins and placed in a half-circle under the chinkapin tree, Matilda would read some biblical passages she had selected. Then, with her serious brown eyes searching each face, she would ask if any among them would care to lead in prayer, and seeing that none of them did, she would always say, "Well den, will ye all join me on bended knee?" As they all kneeled facing her, she would offer a moving, unpretentious prayer, and afterward she'd lead them in singing some spirited song. Even Uncle Pompey's cracked, raspy baritone joined in as they made Slave Row resound with such rousing spirituals as "Joshua fit the battle o' Jericho, Jericho, Jericho," and "the walls come a-tumblin' down." The meeting turned then into a group discussion on the general subject of faith. "This is the Lawd's Day. We all got a soul to save and a heaven to maintain," Matilda might offer in her matter-of-fact way. "We needs to keep in our minds who it was made us, and that was God. Den who it was redeemed us, and that was Christ Jesus. Christ Jesus teached us to be humble and mindful that we can be reborn in the Spirit." "I loves Law Jesus good as anybody," Kizzy testified humbly, "but y'all see I just ain't never knowed that much about him till I was up some size. Even though my mammy say she had me christened when I was just a little thing, at one dem big camp meetin's. Seem like to me we does be best if we's been put next to God when we's youngins," said Sister Sarah. She gestured at Virgil in his grandmammy's lap, "'cause dat way we starts out early soaking up some 'ligion and settin' stow by it." Miss Melizzy spoke to Uncle Pompey. "You don't know. If you'd have started out early, you might have made a preacher. You even got the look of one as it is." "Preacher! How I'm gonna preach and can't even read," he exclaimed. "The Lawd put things to say in yo' mouth if he call you to preach," Matilda said. "Dat husband yourn call hisself preachin' round here once," said Miss Melizzy. "He ever told you about that?" They all laughed, and Kizzy said, "He sure could have made some kind of preacher, much as he loved to show off and run his mouth." "He'd have been one of them trickin' and trancin' preachers holdin' big revivals," said Sister Sarah. They talked for a while about powerful preachers they had all either seen or heard about. Then Uncle Pompey told of his powerfully religious mother, whom he remembered from boyhood on the plantation where he was born. "She was big and fat, and I reckon the shoutin'est woman anybody ever heard of. Remind me of old maid Sister Bessie on the plantation I was raised on," said Miss Melizzy. "She was nother one dem shoutin' womens. She'd got old without no husband, till it come one dem big camp meetin's. Well, she shouted till she went in a trance. She come out in it, sayin' she just had a talk with the Lawd. He say her mission on the earth was to save old Brer Timmons from going to hell by him jumping the broom with sich a Christian woman as her. Scared him so bad he jumped it too." though few of those he ran into on his trips would have guessed from the way he acted that Chicken George had jumped the broom, or ever would. He surprised the women on Slave Row at home with how warmly he took to marriage and how well he treated his wife and family. Never did he return from a cockfight, wearing his scarf and derby, which had become his costume, rain or shine, summer or winter, without winnings to put away. Most of the time, giving Matilda a few dollars, he didn't have much money left after paying for the gifts he, of course, always brought along not only for Matilda and his mammy, but also for Miss Melizzy, Sister Sarah, and Uncle Pompey, as well as for young Virgil. He always came home, too, with at least an hour's worth of news about whatever he had seen or heard about on his travels. As his Slave Row family gathered around him, Kizzy would nearly always think how her African pappy had brought another Slave Row most of its news, and now it was her son. Returning once from a long journey that had taken him to Charleston, Chicken George described so many dem great big sailin' ships they poles look like a thicket, and like ants packin' and pullin' out dem great big tobacco hogsheads and all kinds of other stuff to sail the water to that England and different mo places. Looks like wherever me and Massa travels nowadays, it's diggin' canals and layin' dem gravel highways and buildin' railroads. Just buildin' dis country with dey muscles. Another time he had heard that the white folks threatenin' the Indians 'bout takin' in so many on dey reservations. Plenty dem Creeks and Seminoles done married. It's even some Indian chiefs, but I hears dem Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Cherokees hates even worse'n white folks does. He would be asked far fewer questions than they really wanted to know the answers to, and soon, making polite excuses, Kizzy, Miss Melizzy, Sister Sarah, and Uncle Pompey would disappear into their cabins to let him and Matilda be alone. "Done told myself you never gonna hear me with no whole lot of complainin', George," she told him one such night as they lay in bed, "but I sure do feel like I ain't hardly got no husband a lot of times." "Knows what you means, honey. I sho does," he said easily. "Out there travelin' with Massa, or sometime me and Uncle Mingo up all night with some dem sick chickens. I be's just thinkin' 'bout you and the young'un." Matilda bit her tongue, choosing not to voice her doubts, even her suspicions, about some of the things he said. Instead, she asked, "You figure it's ever gonna get any better, George? Ever get Massa rich enough, so he be willin' to stay home hisself? But look, it ain't hurtin' us none, baby. Look how we savin' if I can keep bringin' in winnin's like I is." "Money ain't you," said Matilda flatly, and then she made her tone softer. "And we'd save a lot mo' if you just ease up buyin' presents for everybody. We all 'preciates 'em, you knows dat. But George, where I ever gonna wear sich as dat fine silk press I specs better'n any missy got?" "Baby, if you just put that dress on right here, then pull it off for me. You's terrible." He was the most exciting man, beyond anyone she had even dreamed of knowing, at least in that way, and he certainly was a fine provider, but she didn't really trust him, and she couldn't help wondering whether he loved her and their baby as much as he did traveling with the Massa. Was there anything in the scriptures about chickens? Vaguely she recalled something in Matthew, if she wasn't mistaken, about "a hen gathereth her chickens beneath her wings." I must look that up, she told herself. When she did have a husband at home, though, Matilda submerged her doubts and disappointments and tried to be the best wife she knew how. If she knew he was coming, a big meal was waiting. If he came unexpectedly, she prepared one right away, day or night. After a while, she quit trying to get him to bless a meal, simply saying a short grace herself, then delighting in watching him eat while he held the gurgling Virgil in his lap. Then afterward, with the boy put to bed, examining George's face, she pinched out blackheads, or heating water to half fill the tin tub, she would wash his hair and his back, and if he arrived complaining of aching feet, she would rub them with a warm paste of roasted onions and homemade soap. Finally, whenever the candles were blown out and they were again between her fresh sheets, Chicken George would make up for his absences to the utmost. About the time Virgil began to walk, Matilda was great with child again. She was surprised it hadn't happened sooner. With another child on the way, Grandmammy Kizzy decided the time she had come to take her son aside and tell him a thing or two that had been on her mind for a long time. He arrived home from a trip one Sunday morning to find her minding Virgil while Matilda was up in the big house helping Miss Melizzy prepare dinner for guests who were soon to arrive. "You sit down right there," she said, wasting no time. He did, eyebrows risen. "I don't care if you's grown now, I still brought you in dis world, and you gonna listen. God done give you a real good woman you ain't no ways treatin' right. I ain't foolin' wid you now. You hear me? I still take a stick to your behind in a minute. You got to spend mo time wid yo' wife and youngin', and her already big wid yo' next one, too." "Mammy, what you spec?" he said as irritably as he dared. "When massa say go, tell him I ain't?" Kizzy's eyes were blazing. "Ain't talking about dat and you know it. Tellin' dat po gal you settin' up nights tendin' sick chickens and sich as dat. Where you get all dis lyin' and drinkin' and gamblin' and runnin' round? You knows I ain't raised you like dat. And don't think dis just me talkin'. Tilda ain't no fool. She just ain't let you know she's seein' right through you, too." Without another word, Grandmammy Kizzy stalked angrily from the cabin. With Massa Leah being among the entrants for the great 1830 cockfighting tournament in Charleston, no one could criticize Chicken George for being away when the baby was born. He returned as ecstatic to learn about his second son, whom Matilda had already named Ashford, after her brother, as he was aglow with his good luck. "Massa winned over $1,000, and I winned 50 into hack fights. Y'all oughta hear how white folks in both has started to hollerin'. I'm bettin' on dat Chicken George." He told her how in Charleston Massa Leah had learned that President Andrew Jackson was a man after their own style. "Ain't nobody love cockfightin' mo'n he do. He call in dem big congressmens and senators, and he show 'em a time fightin' dem Tennessee birds of his'n right there in dat White House. Massa say that Jackson gamble and drink wid any man. Dey say when dem matchin' chestnut hosses pullin' him in dat fine president's coach, he be settin' up dere with his velvet-lined suitcase o' liquor right beside him. Massa say far as Southern white men's concerned, he can stay president till he get tired." Matilda was unimpressed, but Chicken George had seen something in Charleston that shook her, and the others on Slave Row, as deeply as it had him. "I bet you I seen a mile long o' bein' drive along in chains. Lawdy!" "From where?" asked Miss Melizzy. "Some soul out in North and South Caroliny, but mainly out in Virginia, was what I heerd," he said. "Different Charleston tole me it's thousands a month gettin' took to great big cotton plantations steady bein' cleared out in de woods in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. Dey say de ol' style traders on a hoss is gone, done become big companies wid offices in big hotels. Dey say it's even paddle-wheeled ships carryin' nothin' but chained up Virginia down to New Orleans, and dey says—" "Just hush!" Kizzy sprang upright. "Hush!" She went bolting toward her cabin in tears. "What come over her?" George asked Matilda after the others had left in embarrassment. "Ain't you know?" she snapped. "Her mammy and pappy in Virginia last she know, and you scare her half to death." Chicken George looked sick. His face told her he hadn't realized, but Matilda refused to let him off that easily. She had become convinced that for all of his worldliness, he was sorely lacking in sensitivity about too many things. "You know's well as I does Mammy Kizzy been sole herself, just like I was," she told him. "Anybody ever sole ain't gonna never forget it, and won't never be the same no mo'." She looked at him significantly. "You ain't never been. That's how come you don't understand no massa can't never be trusted, includin' your'n." "What you rilin' at me fo'?" he demanded testily. "You axed me what upset Mammy Kizzy and I told you. Ain't got no mo' to say about it." Matilda caught herself. She didn't want harshness between her and her husband. After a moment's silence, she managed a small smile. "George, I knows what make Mammy Kizzy feel better. Go make her come on over here to tell you dis baby 'bout his African grandpappy like you told Virgil." And that's just what he did.